There's a building in rural Pennsylvania that hasn't been photographed in over 40 years. The local historical society refuses to acknowledge it exists. When journalists tried to access the county records about what happened there between 1932 and 1958, they found entire file cabinets had been removed. Not redacted, removed. What remained were 3 handwritten letters from mothers begging someone, anyone, to tell them what happened to their children. The children who went in never came out the same. Some never came out at all, and the ones who survived were taught never to speak about what they saw in the basement. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Willowbrook Home for Exceptional Children opened its doors in the spring of 1932, just as America was, drowning in the depths of the Great Depression. Families were starving, fathers were abandoning their children at church doorsteps, and mothers were making impossible choices. The home presented itself as a sanctuary for children born with physical deformities, developmental disabilities, or what the era called defects of nature. The brochure was printed on expensive paper. It showed clean white buildings surrounded by pastoral farmland. It promised medical care, education, and, most importantly, discretion. What made Willowbrook different from other institutions was its director, a man named Dr. Edmund Gaskill. Gaskill had studied in Vienna under disciples of the early eugenics movement, but his credentials were difficult to verify even then. He had no listed publications, no university would confirm his doctorate, yet he somehow secured funding from 3 private philanthropic societies, all of which dissolved their records in the 1960s. Gaskill's philosophy was published once, in a small medical journal that has since been scrubbed from most archives. He believed that physical deformity was not random, but heritable and manipulable. He believed it could be studied, controlled, and in his words, perfected. Parents who brought their children to Willowbrook were required to sign a document relinquishing all parental rights for a minimum of 5 years. They were told this was for the child's own good, to allow uninterrupted treatment. Most families never saw their children again. When they wrote letters, they received vague responses about progress and breakthroughs. When they visited, they were turned away at the gate. The local sheriff was on Gaskill's payroll. So were the county clerks, the postmaster, and 3 members of the state legislature. Willowbrook became a black site hidden in plain sight, surrounded by farmland and protected by a wall of bureaucratic silence. By 1938, over 200 children lived inside Willowbrook's walls. The youngest was 3 years old, the oldest was 17. Some had cleft palates, some had scoliosis, some had cognitive delays or seizures or missing limbs. Others had nothing visibly wrong with them at all. Those were the ones Gaskill called his controls. The building had 3 floors above ground and 1 below. It was the basement that no one was supposed to talk about. It was the basement where the real work happened. And it was the basement where the children learned what Dr. Gaskill truly meant by perfection. The first hint that something was deeply wrong came in 1940, when a nurse named Catherine Brennan tried to leave Willowbrook after only 6 weeks of employment. She made it as far as the train station in the neighboring town before she was found wandering the platform, incoherent and trembling. She was admitted to a psychiatric facility where she remained for 3 years. Her medical files, obtained decades later by a researcher who wished to remain anonymous, contain one repeated phrase written in her own hand during her hospitalization. She wrote it over 70 times across different pages. "They're making new ones from the old ones." When doctors asked her to explain, she would only rock back and forth and weep. What Catherine Brennan witnessed in the basement of Willowbrook was a program that defied every ethical boundary of medicine, parenthood, and human dignity. Dr. Gaskill had become obsessed with a question that haunted the darkest corners of early 20th century science. Could deformity be induced? Could it be passed down intentionally? He believed that if he could understand the mechanisms of physical abnormality, he could unlock something profound about human biology. But his methods were not theoretical. They were experimental, and his subjects were children who had no one to protect them. Gaskill began by categorizing the children into groups based on their conditions. He kept meticulous records, photographing each child from multiple angles, measuring their skull dimensions, documenting their bone structure and musculature. But the photography was only the beginning. He started arranging the children into what he called breeding pairs once they reached adolescence. The oldest children, those in their mid to late teens, were housed in separate wings. The girls were kept on the eastern side of the third floor, the boys on the western side, and twice a week, under the supervision of carefully selected staff members who signed non-disclosure agreements. Gaskill's program moved into its most disturbing phase. He was attempting to create a second generation of deformity. He believed that by pairing children with similar conditions, he could produce offspring that exhibited predictable, enhanced abnormalities. He called this genetic amplification. The children called it something else. They called it the breeding rooms. The girls who became pregnant, some as young as 14 or 15, were moved to the basement during their final trimester. They gave birth in conditions that were neither hospital nor home. They were alone, except for Gaskill and his two most loyal attendants, both of whom later disappeared from all public records after Willowbrook closed. The babies born in that basement were not given to their mothers. They were not recorded with the county. They were not given names, at least not at first. They were given numbers. And they became the second phase of Gaskill's research, a new generation of test subjects born into captivity, whose existence was never acknowledged by the outside world. Some of the teenage mothers were allowed to return upstairs after giving birth. Others were never seen again. One surviving testimony, recorded in 1987 by a woman who only agreed to speak on the condition of complete anonymity, described hearing screams from the basement that would last for hours, then stop suddenly. She said the silence afterward was worse than the screaming. By 1945, as the world was learning about the atrocities committed in the name of science overseas, Willowbrook was operating at full capacity with nearly 300 children on the premises. But the numbers didn't add up. County records from 1932 to 1945 show that 412 children were admitted to Willowbrook during that period. That left over 100 children unaccounted for. When state investigators finally arrived in 1958, they found a cemetery on the property. It contained 63 marked graves. The markers were simple wooden crosses with numbers burned into the wood. No names, no dates, just numbers. The children who lived in Willowbrook developed their own language, their own codes for survival. They learned which hallways to avoid. They learned which days Dr. Gaskill would come down to the basement. They learned to recognize the sound of his footsteps. The older children tried to protect the younger ones when they could, but protection was a fragile concept in a place where the adults held absolute power and the outside world had forgotten you existed. Some children tried to escape. There are records of at least 14 escape attempts between 1938 and 1956. Not one of them succeeded. The escapes were always handled the same way. The local sheriff would be called. The child would be found within hours, usually hiding in a barn or wandering the rural roads with no idea which direction led to safety. They would be returned to Willowbrook, and then they would disappear into the basement for a period of time that other children could only measure by counting meals. When they came back up, if they came back up, they were different, quieter, more compliant. One survivor described it as the light going out behind their eyes. Another said the children who returned from those punishments moved like sleepwalkers, as if part of them had stayed down there in the dark. Dr. Gaskill kept journals, hundreds of them. They were discovered in a storage unit in New Jersey in 2003, decades after his death. The journals were purchased at auction by a private collector who later donated them to a university archive under the condition they remain sealed for 50 years. But portions were leaked, and what they reveal is a mind that had long ago severed any connection to human empathy. Gaskill wrote about the children the way a farmer writes about livestock. He recorded their measurements, their responses to various stimuli, their breaking points. He documented which children cried when separated from siblings and which ones had learned not to cry at all. He noted which genetic combinations produced the most viable offspring and which ones resulted in stillbirths or infants who didn't survive their first week. In one entry from 1947, Gaskill described a girl he referred to only as Subject 12. She had given birth to 3 children by the age of 19. None of them survived past infancy. In his journal, Gaskill expressed not grief or guilt, but frustration. He wrote that the specimen showed promise, but the outcomes were inconsistent. He was considering, in his words, alternative approaches to ensure better results. Subject 12's name was later identified through cross-referencing with incomplete admission records. Her name was Dorothy Sinclair. She was admitted to Willowbrook at age 11 with a curvature of the spine. She died in the facility in 1951 at age 22. The cause of death listed on the only existing record was heart failure. She was buried in the numbered cemetery. Her family was never notified. The staff at Willowbrook were not all monsters, but they all made a choice. Some genuinely believed they were participating in important medical research. Others needed the job and convinced themselves that what happened behind closed doors was none of their business. A few tried to speak out. Those people found themselves suddenly unemployed, blacklisted from other medical positions, or in one case, committed to an asylum under suspicious circumstances. The message was clear. Loyalty to Willowbrook meant silence, and silence was enforced through fear, money, and the understanding that powerful people wanted this work to continue undisturbed. There was one staff member, however, who kept records of her own. Her name was Margaret Hollis, and she worked as a night attendant from 1949 to 1957. Margaret was in her 50s when she took the position, a widow who needed income and had experience caring for her own disabled son. What she saw at Willowbrook horrified her, but she was smart enough to know that direct confrontation would accomplish nothing. So instead, she documented everything. She kept a diary hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the Bible she carried with her. She wrote in careful, tiny script. She recorded dates, names when she knew them, and descriptions of what she witnessed. Margaret's diary described the basement in detail. She wrote about the examination tables fitted with leather restraints. She described a room she called the birthing chamber, where teenage girls labored alone except for Gaskill's clinical presence. She wrote about a nursery that held infants in rows of metal cribs, none of them crying because they had learned that crying brought no comfort. She documented the injections Gaskill administered to some of the children, though she didn't know what the substances were. She recorded the temperatures he exposed them to, the dietary restrictions he imposed on certain groups, the surgical procedures he performed without anesthesia, because he claimed the subjects didn't process pain the same way normal children did. One entry from December of 1953 haunted Margaret so deeply that she underlined it 3 times. She described a boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, who had been brought to the basement that evening. He had no visible deformities. He was, in her words, a beautiful child with dark curls and bright eyes. She never learned why he was there, but she watched as Gaskill measured him, photographed him, and then made a series of marks on his spine with what appeared to be a surgical pen. The boy was crying, asking for his mother. Gaskill told him to be still. Margaret's diary ends that entry with a single sentence. "I do not know if I will see him again. I do not know if I want to." Margaret Hollis continued working at Willowbrook for 4 more years after that night. She witnessed dozens more procedures, births, and disappearances. She filled 3 hollowed-out Bibles with her observations. And in 1957, when she finally left Willowbrook, she took those Bibles with her and hid them in her attic. She never reported what she saw to the authorities. She never came forward. When asked years later, shortly before her death in 1991, why she stayed silent, she said something chilling. She said that she tried once to tell a state official what was happening. The official listened politely, thanked her for her concern, and then asked her if she was aware that making false accusations against a respected medical institution could result in serious legal consequences. He reminded her that she had signed non-disclosure agreements, and then he asked her if she had family she cared about. Margaret never spoke to authorities again, but she kept the Bibles. And when she died, her granddaughter found them. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The end came for Willowbrook, not because of justice, but because of money. By 1956, Dr. Gaskill was 71 years old, and his primary benefactors had either died or quietly withdrawn their funding. The facility was becoming expensive to maintain and difficult to justify. The post-war era had brought new scrutiny to eugenic practices, and even the most protected institutions were feeling pressure to clean up their public images. Willowbrook was scheduled for closure. The official story was that advances in medical treatment meant children with disabilities could now be cared for in their own communities. The real reason was that the people who had protected Gaskill for over 2 decades wanted to erase the evidence before anyone started asking uncomfortable questions. The closure process began in January of 1957 and was supposed to take 6 months. During that time, something remarkable and terrible happened. The children began to disappear faster than they could be transferred to other facilities. In January, there were 247 children at Willowbrook. By June, there were 93. The official records show transfers to various state institutions, foster placements, and family reunifications. But when researchers later tried to trace these children, they found that many of the receiving institutions had no record of ever accepting transfers from Willowbrook. The foster families listed didn't exist, and the families who supposedly reclaimed their children had, in many cases, been dead for years. What happened to those missing children remains one of the darkest mysteries of Willowbrook. Some researchers believe they were transferred to other experimental facilities that were still operating under deeper cover. Others believe they were simply killed and buried in unmarked locations around the property. There's evidence for both theories. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 2008 revealed anomalies consistent with additional burial sites in the woods surrounding the main building. At least 30 possible graves were identified. None have been officially excavated. The property is privately owned now, and the owners have refused all requests for archaeological investigation. A few children did make it out legitimately. They were transferred to state hospitals or returned to families who had been searching for them for years. These survivors carried with them memories that would torment them for the rest of their lives. Most refused to speak about their experiences. A handful gave testimony decades later, when they were elderly and felt they had nothing left to lose. Their accounts corroborate Margaret Hollis's diary in disturbing detail. They described the breeding program, the forced pregnancies, the babies born in the basement. They described children who disappeared and were never mentioned again. They described Gaskill's examinations, his measurements, his absolute power over their bodies and their lives. One survivor, a man named Thomas Rutherford, who was at Willowbrook from age 9 to age 17, gave an interview in 2011. He was 81 years old at the time and suffering from advanced cancer. He said he wanted to speak before he died because someone needed to say their names. He recited a list of 12 children he had known at Willowbrook, children who had been his friends, his protectors, his family in that nightmare place. He gave their first names and described them in detail, what they looked like, what their laughs sounded like, what games they invented to survive the endless boredom and terror. And then he said that every single one of those 12 children had vanished during the final months before closure, not transferred, not released, vanished. When Thomas was finally taken from Willowbrook in August of 1957, he was put in a car and driven away. As they passed through the front gates, he looked back at the building. He said he could see faces in the upper windows, small, pale faces pressed against the glass, watching him leave. And he knew, even then, that those children would never leave. Not alive. Dr. Edmund Gaskill died in 1962 in a private nursing home in upstate New York. He was 77 years old. His obituary in the local newspaper described him as a dedicated physician who had devoted his life to helping disadvantaged children. It mentioned his work at Willowbrook Home for Exceptional Children and praised his commitment to advancing medical understanding of developmental disorders. There was no mention of the breeding program, no mention of the missing children, No mention of the cemetery with numbered graves. The obituary listed no surviving family members. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in a location that was never recorded. It was as if, even in death, someone wanted to make sure there would be nothing left to investigate. But erasing Gaskill didn't erase what he had done. The children born in Willowbrook's basement, the second generation that was never supposed to exist, had to go somewhere. Some died in infancy and were buried in that numbered cemetery. But others survived. They were toddlers and young children when the facility closed, and they were scattered. Some were placed in orphanages under false names with fabricated birth certificates. Others were adopted by families who were told the children were foundlings, or the offspring of unwed mothers who had died in childbirth. None of these children knew where they had come from. None of them knew about Willowbrook. They grew up with gaps in their medical histories, with birth certificates that didn't quite make sense, with a feeling that something about their origin story had been deliberately obscured. In the early 2000s, as DNA testing became affordable and accessible, some of these people began searching for their biological families. What they found instead were connections they couldn't explain. Half-siblings they'd never known existed, genetic markers that suggested their parents were closely related, medical conditions that appeared with unusual frequency across multiple family lines. These discoveries led some of them to genealogists and researchers who specialized in closed adoption cases. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth about Willowbrook began to emerge. Not from official records, which had been mostly destroyed, not from government investigations, which had been deliberately stifled, but from the DNA of the children themselves, still carrying the evidence of what had been done to their parents. One woman, who has chosen to remain anonymous but whose story was documented by a geneticist in 2016, discovered through DNA testing that her mother and father were actually half-siblings. Both had been born with skeletal abnormalities. Both had been residents of the same institution in Pennsylvania during the 1940s and 50s. When she pressed for more information, she was eventually directed to a researcher who had been investigating Willowbrook for decades. That's when she learned that she wasn't the product of a normal family. She was the product of an experiment. Her parents hadn't chosen each other. They had been paired by Dr. Gaskill as part of his breeding program. She herself had been born in that basement. And the birth defect she had lived with her entire life, a condition affecting her spine and ribcage, was exactly what Gaskill had been trying to create. The psychological impact of these revelations has been devastating for the descendants of Willowbrook. Many have struggled with feelings of contamination, with the knowledge that their very existence was the result of cruelty and coercion. Some have formed support groups, connecting with others who share this dark origin. They call themselves the Willowbrook Legacy, though they keep their communications private and their identities protected. They're not seeking publicity or attention. They're seeking acknowledgement. They want someone in authority to admit that Willowbrook existed, that the program was real, that their parents and grandparents were victims. But that acknowledgement has never come. The state of Pennsylvania has never officially investigated Willowbrook. No apology has been issued. No memorial has been erected. The descendants are left with DNA evidence, scattered testimony, and Margaret Hollis's hidden diaries. They're left with the truth that no one in power wants to confirm. The building that housed Willowbrook Home for Exceptional Children still stands. It's been abandoned since 1958, over 60 years of decay and neglect. The windows are boarded up. The roof has partially collapsed. Nature has begun to reclaim the property, with vines crawling up the brick walls and trees pushing through the foundation. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to approach it at night, but very few actually make it past the front gate. Those who do report an overwhelming sense of wrongness, a feeling that they're being watched from the empty windows. Some have reported hearing sounds from inside the building, sounds that resemble children crying or calling out. These reports are usually dismissed as urban legend, the kind of ghost stories that grow up around any abandoned building with a dark history. But there's something different about Willowbrook. The property has changed hands multiple times since it was closed, but no one has ever successfully developed it. Every attempt to demolish the building has been met with mysterious obstacles. equipment failures, sudden loss of funding, contractors who start the job and then refuse to continue. In 2004, a development company purchased the land with plans to build luxury condominiums. They hired a demolition crew to take down the main building. On the first day of demolition, 3 workers were injured in accidents that the safety inspector called highly unusual. The next day, the entire crew walked off the job. When interviewed, the foreman said only that the building didn't want to come down. The development company abandoned the project within a month. The numbered cemetery is still there, though many of the wooden crosses have rotted away. What remains are 63 small depressions in the earth, arranged in neat rows beneath the shadow of oak trees that were saplings when the children were buried. No one tends these graves. No one leaves flowers. The only visitors are researchers and descendants, people who come looking for answers that will never fully materialize. They stand in that cemetery and try to imagine the children whose bodies rest beneath their feet, children who were used and discarded, children whose names were taken from them, children who deserved protection and received only cruelty. In 2022, a documentary filmmaker attempted to create a comprehensive record of what happened at Willowbrook. She spent 3 years gathering testimony, documents, and DNA evidence. She interviewed survivors, descendants, and researchers. She obtained copies of Margaret Hollis's diaries and portions of Gaskell's journals. She hired ground-penetrating radar specialists to survey the property. Her documentary was 90 minutes long and contained evidence that should have sparked national outrage. It premiered at a small film festival and received strong reviews. But within weeks, it disappeared from circulation. The filmmaker then reported receiving legal threats from unnamed parties claiming defamation. Her funding sources withdrew. Streaming platforms that had expressed interest suddenly backed out. The documentary still exists, but it's nearly impossible to find. Copies circulate quietly among researchers and advocates, passed hand to hand like contraband. This is how history gets buried, not through dramatic cover-ups or government raids, but through quiet pressure, strategic silence, and the understanding that some stories are too uncomfortable to allow into the mainstream. Willowbrook challenges our fundamental beliefs about American institutions, about medical ethics, about the protections we assume existed for the most vulnerable. It forces us to confront the reality that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they wear white coats. Sometimes they're protected by respectable people who value reputation over truth. And sometimes their crimes are allowed to fade into obscurity because acknowledging them would require an accountability that powerful institutions are simply unwilling to provide. The children of Willowbrook deserved better. They deserved safety, dignity, and the chance to live lives that weren't defined by other people's cruelty. Instead, they were used as raw material for experiments that violated every principle of human decency. Their stories should be taught in schools. Their names should be remembered. The people who enabled Gaskell should be named and held accountable, even if only in the historical record. But that hasn't happened. And as the years pass and the last survivors die, the window for justice grows smaller. All that remains is this: the story itself, told by people who refuse to let it disappear completely. Told so that somewhere, somehow, the children of Willowbrook are finally acknowledged, finally remembered, finally given the voice they were denied in life. That's why stories like this matter. That's why you're still watching. Because forgetting is its own kind of violence. And remembering, even when it hurts, is the only redemption we can offer to those who suffered in silence.